And we're back today. We are here today. And we're back today. Um, we are here today with Jacqueline Kennelly.
Oh,
She's
no.
an associate. I'm sorry. Did I pronounce? That's what I was supposed to ask you if I pronounced your name right.
Yeah,
Is it
that's all right. Everyone does it. It's Kennelly.
Kennelly?
Kennelly.
Kennelly?
Kennelly.
Am I still not pronouncing it right?
Like, hey, Nelly. Kennelly.
Hey Nelly, Kennelly.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm.
So we're here today with Jacqueline Kennelly, an associate professor of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. Her work encompasses youth and cultural studies, critical education studies, urban sociology, social movements, feminist theory, and there was a bunch of other stuff I didn't even know what it was, so I had to cut it out. She has done research with young activists across Canada, low-income youth in Toronto and Vancouver, and her book on marginally housed youth is called Olympic Exclusions, Youth Poverty, and Social Legacies. Jacqueline, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So I immediately liked you as soon as I went to your website because there's there's a fantastic photo of your cat, you and your cat there.
Yeah.
Is your cat still alive?
Oh, sadly, he just passed away. Really
So,
awful. He was a very sweet and charming cat. So he
oh,
got kidney disease and
I'm so sorry to bring up this raw, open
no, that's
wound.
okay. He's a very famous cat in his own way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry to hear that. We are, everyone bags on us because we're no Calgary Olympics, and everyone says we're so negative because we're no, but we're actually very positive people. We're pro dog, we're pro cat, pro beer, pro ice cream. We're lots of fun.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I hope you're. I'm really sorry. Maybe my cat will make an appearance.
Oh, that'd be good. Well, and
Yeah,
I
he's.
have another cat and a dog. So,
Oh, okay. Well, all right. Let's
sure.
hope.
Yeah.
Right on. So let's start with asking, so how did you get started on this line of research?
Well, I was living in Vancouver as the debate was happening around Vancouver hosting the 2010 games, and I was living in Vancouver for the plebiscite, which went towards hosting the games. And this was before I got involved in the research, but I knew there was a lot of opposition, and I was interested in the opposition. And at the same time, I was working with young people, low-income young people, and I started to get curious about what it meant for a city. There wasn't a lot of information about what it meant for a city's residents when a city hosted the Olympics, and I had the opportunity to. This was early. I was just finishing my PhD, and I had been given. I'd won a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and of course, London was getting ready to host a few years later, and so. Given that I was already in Vancouver and going to London, I was like, I'm going to actually explore this in a bit more detail, and that's how it began. It was from living in about to be Olympic host city. That was 2008. And going to do research in a country that was about to host the Olympics, and bringing that together with my interest in low-income young people and urban inequality, and those were the pieces that went into the project that ultimately turned into a 6-year research project on the impact of the Olympics on low-income youth in both cities.
6 years.
Yep.
Wow. I
Mm-hmm.
can't imagine. That's really interesting. So the plebiscite in Vancouver, it was successful. Do you have any opinion on why it was successful? Because the end result of the Vancouver Games, they still there's this fallacy out there that it was much more successful than it actually was and that it made money.
Yes.
So in the end of the day, the story wasn't really that different from any other Olympics, but they definitely did a great job selling it.
Yeah.
A lot of the men, I think, I'm not sure how many cities have had plebiscites since Vancouver or maybe previous that have bailed, but Vancouver is one of the few cities that when put to the citizens, they actually voted yes. Why was it successful there?
So I think there are a few things that were going on. I mean, the mayor was very, very much in favor, and the city council in general was very supportive. The mayor was popular at the time. This was prior to Gregor Robertson. And another thing that was happening, and I'm going to guess it might happen in Calgary, although it'll be something to watch for, is that the numbers that were put out about the benefits, the economic benefits to Vancouver, were wildly exaggerated. I'm talking to a scale of, 100,000 times exaggerations. And this was particularly egregious. Now, I didn't know this at the time because I wasn't in the research yet. This was later as I was examining, and this is part of what I explore in the book, is they had done an economic impact assessment of what kind of benefits the games would give. And the numbers that economic impact assessment generated were actually fairly accurate. But the proponents of the games, the yes side, completely ignored those numbers and pulled these completely random numbers out of their hats, essentially, and said, actually, so there was Jack Poole, who was, I think he was the CEO of the bid committee. He wrote a piece in the Vancouver Sun saying that the Vancouver Olympics would generate $2 billion in incremental tax benefits.
Wow.
Completely absurd.
Yeah.
And that distinction, incremental, what that means is that would be over and above anything that otherwise Vancouver could anticipate. So incremental means new revenue. And he emphasizes this in his piece. He says that's $2 billion in new revenue. It's completely false. There was nothing like that in this economic impact assessment, which said gave a much more modest number of incremental tax, because actually there isn't much. Like the studies have shown that there isn't much incremental tax revenue for a mega event, because what happens is people who would otherwise spend their money in the city just spend it on the Olympics. The people who come for the games displace tourists who would come otherwise. Like there doesn't tend to be an actual huge economic upswing. So that's one of the reasons. There was just pure misinformation spread by the yes side, and they had a lot of money to make big fancy billboards and really take out full page ads and really work to sway public opinion. So there was a very organized opposition in Vancouver, just as there is in Calgary. But they didn't have the dollars, and they didn't lie.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's our problem. We don't lie. So let's talk about, so your research has been a lot around a lot of the youth and the games. Yeah. So let me ask you this, don't the games incorporate aid for youth and those below the poverty line?
Yeah. So this is actually one of the main lines that I'm pursuing in the book, which is that the Olympic Games, since their inception, and now we're talking the modern Olympics, right? People think of the Olympics as dating back 2,000 years. They don't. They date back from 1896. When Pierre de Coubertin envisioned that these sort of massive multinational bringing together of countries and blah blah blah. But right from the get-go was incorporated this idea of the games benefiting young people. And that has been consistent throughout the modern Olympic history of the games being good for the young in various ways. But the reality is different. And I mean, the thing is, we got to ask which young people benefit. The young people I was working with who were in Vancouver, they were homeless. They were street-involved homeless. They were accessing shelters. They were really in difficult, desperate circumstances. In London, England, they were a step away from homeless. They if they hadn't had this sort of temporary housing that they were in, they would have been homeless. But they were housed, but it was temporary and it was precarious. Mm-hmm. These young people are not benefiting. Is that your cat?
Yeah.
Oh,
say hi, Gizmo.
Oh, you're beautiful.
He's very handsome. Say hi. Say hi to everyone. Okay.
So the idea of the Olympics benefiting youth is used as a trope to promote the Olympics, and that's really consistent. Mm-hmm. But the question of which youth is rarely asked, and the question of what kind of benefits it is also rarely asked. Usually it's like, oh, well, it will inspire young people. There have been some really interesting studies because there's a lot of interest in the Olympics in the scholarly community, saying, so does watching the Olympics inspire young people to participate in sports? Because that's one of the claims. And the
Mm-hmm.
answer is no, unequivocally no. Because it doesn't matter if you watch the Olympics, but you don't have access to sporting facilities and lessons and equipment. It doesn't matter how inspired you are, you're not going to be able to participate in the Olympics. Or in
What do you, hang on. You're telling me that kids can't just go and start bobsledding? Yeah, you're telling me that's not an easy sport to get into.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
So, you know, yeah, the absurdity of it is kind of obvious when you start picking it apart, but there's it appeals to emotions, right? That idea of, oh, well, the Olympics, it will help the young, it'll help the next generation, it will inspire people. And I mean, I have the utmost respect for Olympic athletes. They are phenomenal. They're phenomenal. So like, this is nothing against the athletes themselves, but the way in which the Olympics markets itself really builds on that emotional response that people have to watching these remarkable, mostly young people, compete, and then they build on that, and you see it in the Olympic advertising and the you know, the corporations that are a massive part of the Olympic, so-called Olympic movement now, with their commercials and everything. They all build on that kind of emotional resonance that people feel for their ads, and this idea of inspiring young people is part of that.
Yeah. Didn't Thomas Bach say in an interview just like a month or two ago that in regards to the city in Switzerland that bailed on the referendum because they didn't have enough financial information, and he criticized them for focusing too much on the finances and not enough on the emotion?
Yeah, yeah, and this is this funny line that the Olympics, you know, people have been involved. So the other thing to know about the Olympics is, so the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is an extremely elite group of people. We're talking princes.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, and it always has been. I mean, the elite of the elite, right? Like not just, we're not just talking about heads of corporations. We're talking about royalty, who make up the IOC and always have. And part of the Olympic history is about actually distancing itself from commercialism and critiquing commercialism for being too crass. And there was this whole moment in Olympic history where they refused athletes from being allowed to earn any income. They had to be amateur athletes. But of course, the whole idea of amateur is really problematic, and you know, like these funny divisions where amateur, you know, someone who I can't remember the exact examples, but there's some really hilarious ways in which this division was laid out between amateur and working, and a lot of it was a class division. So anyways, this idea of the Olympics as being trying to remove itself from commercialism, it has an old history, but is completely absurd in the current moment, because the Olympics is all about commercial and corporate interests, and has been at least since the early 80s, and is just increasingly like that. And you know, that's the other big problem with the Olympic Games, is that, so from 1984, when LA happened, that was the first Olympics that was almost entirely privately funded. There was relatively little public money went into that. And that was because LA was able to negotiate this special deal, because nobody else wanted the Olympics at the time. Because prior to 84, there'd been Munich, where the Israeli athletes had been assassinated. There'd been Montreal, which, you know, they just finished paying off their Olympic debt a few years ago. And there had been Moscow, which had been boycotted by the US. So no cities wanted the Olympics. LA took the Olympics on the agreement that they would not spend much public money on it. And so they did that, and they were hugely successful, and this opened the door to this kind of corporatization of the Olympics. And then it also meant more cities wanted it because they saw LA was a success. But what has happened since 1984 is the share of public money that has gone into the Olympics has steadily increased. So every city, no subsequent city has been able to negotiate that same deal with the IOC. And so the city, whatever city takes on the Olympics, is bound to ensure that the Olympics happens, even if it means spending, you know, millions and millions or billions, actually, we're talking about billions in the end of public money, right? The Calgary, they've predicted 7 billion. That's probably a modest estimate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's public money. Most of that is going to be public money. And so this idea of the Olympics as being free from commercialism is really absurd, because it's all about corporate interests, but it's corporate interests that are subsidized by public money.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of hidden costs too. Like when you're just speaking about advertising, I was speaking with Moshe Lander a while ago, and he was telling me that there's this rule with the IOC that all billboard advertising within like 3 or 5 kilometers of any Olympic venue has to be all Olympic advertising. So that means requiring to buy out whoever has that sign during that period. So
Yeah.
there's that whole additional cost that nobody really talks about, and probably nobody has ever planned for.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you know,
No, there's so many like ridiculous things that is also a really frightening thing when an Olympics comes to a city, is the way in which the Olympic marketing scheme takes over the city. So let me give you an example from London, where I was doing field work. And the London Olympics happened in a really low-income neighborhood, and a lot of the claims were made about regenerating and development and how great it was in East London in Stratford.
I've heard that, and I've seen videos of it, and
Yeah, and
some of those residents were even stoked.
Oh
after.
yeah, no, they were excited because they were buying into the rhetoric. Oh, it's going to regenerate and there'll be new jobs and whatever. But I was there and I was working with these people, and this is not the low-income folks that lived in that neighborhood, and this was not what happened. And so, as a very specific example, in that low-income neighborhood, not very far from the Olympic Stadium, there was a shop that had been there for 20 years, and it was called the Olympic Cafe. And it had been there a long time. It was Greek owners. And, it was a local gathering spot. The Olympic, I don't know, who was involved, but someone from the London organizing committee came along and told them that they had to change the name of their cafe. And they had to do this as one of the rules that gets imposed by the Olympics, because they don't want to have what's called, what's it called? There's a name for it. I've forgotten the name, but like crash advertising. Like they think other people are going to use the Olympic symbol, and they need to reserve the Olympic symbolism and the rings for the corporate sponsors like McDonald's and Coke and those so-called top sponsors.
Yeah.
Who have paid millions and millions of dollars for the right to advertise. So this little local cafe had to change their name, and what they did is they painted over the O. So it became the Olympic Cafe. They're able to get away with that. But it's just so absurd, right? And then the irony, so they, I think they kind of swallowed this, because they're like, well, we're going to make a lot of money during the Olympics. The way they built the infrastructure directed all of the tourists away from the low-income neighborhood into this whole new area that had been built just for the games. And so, in fact, that neighborhood lost money during the Olympics, because no one was going in that direction. So, yeah.
Amazing. So while we're on that topic of housing, that's something the boosters always talk about, is that, they're going to build an athletes village, and afterwards that's going to become low income housing.
Yeah.
I look at even the athletes village. I've been meaning to go on to MLS and look at what are condos now of what was the athletes village on Broadcast Hill here in Calgary.
Right.
I can't imagine it's low income housing. Do you recall what happened in Vancouver with the athletes village there? Is that being used as low income housing now?
So one of the commitments that is consistently made by Olympic proponents and the Olympic bid committees, and there's nothing that holds them to this, is that they'll leave an affordable housing legacy. And this has been happening since the Sydney Games in 2000. It probably wasn't a part of the Calgary bid in '88, because there wasn't that kind of focus. But since the turn of the millennium, we've consistently had this promise of affordable housing legacy, and that was definitely a part of the Vancouver bid. And they made a commitment to convert the athletes' housing. I think it was going to be 30% affordable housing. And that was in 2003. And then 2008 happened. And what happened in 2008? The world economy crashed.
Mm.
And Vancouver City Council was left bailing out the developer of Millennium, was the name of the developer, who had been on for building the Athletes Village. They could no longer afford to do that. Their assets evaporated. And so the city of Vancouver had to buy out their debt and take on the financial responsibility for building the Athletes Village. At that point, the discussion turned to, well, that idea of affordable housing was nice beforehand, but now that we've had to pay all this money to build the village, we can no longer afford to put in affordable housing. And so eventually some affordable housing went in, but much less than had been originally committed. I don't know the exact numbers. Essentially it got turned almost all into high-end condos.
Well, that's unfortunate. I can tell you Calgary is going to be a totally different story. I have no doubt. The yes side has told me, the boosters have told me, no, it's going to be low income housing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, let me, can I talk about the London case? Because London
please.
is often held up as an example of where the affordable housing promise was fulfilled.
Oh.
And I want to highlight why that's not true. Because what happened in London was they committed to whatever the numbers were. I think it was also 30% affordable housing. And at the time of the bid, when they committed to this 30% affordable housing was defined as social housing, 50% of market rent.
That's right.
And that was under the Labour government. And then the government changed and it became the conservative Lib Dem coalition. And they changed the definition of affordable housing. And so it became 80% of market rent. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to London in the UK, that housing and rents are through the roof. And so 80% of market rent makes it barely affordable for, someone with a kind of solid middle class income, right? So again, and they've held to this. Well, no, we stuck to we did it. It was 30% affordable housing, but the definition of affordable housing had changed. And so the low income people who lived in that neighborhood have largely been pushed out because of the gentrification and the rent pressure.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can talk about, and I wasn't aware of this until I was reading something you wrote online. The Youth Olympics?
Yeah.
Wasn't even aware that was a thing. What is that, and what happened in Vancouver?
So the Youth Olympics was organized by the IOC. The first one was in 2010, I think, but in Singapore. So it's a separate event, and it was meant to become a kind of recurring event focused on young people. I actually haven't followed. I don't know if it has continued. It didn't happen in Vancouver, though, so they're separate events. But yeah, it's part of that, like I was talking about, the sort of ongoing Olympic focus on young people. And, good on them. I think it's great to have events for young people. But I'm a little bit cynical about how it gets rolled out in terms of claims about Olympic benefits.
Yeah, exactly right. Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm wondering also, we can also talk about what was the 2010 inclusive inner city commitment statement, and how did that work out? It sounds like the city tried to make a commitment that they weren't going to get involved in what you typically see in all these cities, these street sweeps that happen, where they're just trying to get away anybody the city deems as undesirable out of the view of the tourists.
Yeah.
So that sounds like Vancouver's a very, liberal city. And that statement sounds great. Are you telling me that didn't happen?
Yeah. So the inclusive inner city commitments was pushed by a group of advocates and activists who were concerned that the Olympics were going to go forward without any brakes on, right? And so it was actually a fantastic coalition of unions and progressive organizations and the IOCC, the Impacts on Community Coalition, are one of the main groups organizing against the Olympics. And they worked with the city to develop, and with the bid committee to develop these inner city inclusive commitment statements, which included this commitment to affordable housing. It included a commitment to jobs for low-income residents. It included ensuring that there wouldn't be any displacement because of the rising housing costs and all that. Basically what happened, and so the IOCC, this Impacts on Communities Coalition, they kept a report card, and you may have seen it. They tried to file a report card every year or so on how well the bid committee, which turned into VANOC, was keeping to its inner city inclusivity commitments. And they were giving them Ds and Fs because they just consistently weren't meeting those commitments. Because basically what happens is after a city wins the Olympics, there is nothing that compels the organizing committee to meet the commitments that it laid out in its bid document. There's absolutely nothing. So, basically those commitments disappeared. Now, what you're talking about low-income people, homeless people being pushed out of the city, because there's a lot of attention on that. And so there's a lot of concern that this would happen in Vancouver, and a lot of opposition to that happening, a lot of public opposition, sort of people that would not have been a popular thing. But what I found in my research, because I was working with homeless youth, is that the push out of the visible tourist areas actually took place the year before the games. So in my research, I was talking to youth before, during, and after the games. So for Vancouver, I was there in 2009, then 2010 during the games, and 2011 the year after. For London, I was there 2011, 2012, 2013. And so in Vancouver, what the youth told me in 2009 was that they were being policed really intensively in visible tourist areas. So if you know Vancouver, Robson Street, Granville, Burrard, all around the downtown core and the West End. And they were being pushed in the sense that, not literally pushed, but in the sense of being policed really intensely in the West End, but not being policed intensely at all in the downtown East Side. And so the effect was that they were being pushed into the downtown East Side, which is an incredibly difficult neighborhood, and it was a neighborhood that a lot of them were trying to escape. And so that pressure was actually the year before the games. During the games, what the youth told me was that the police were really restrained, that they found they were not being pushed off the streets. And everyone was kind of surprised by this. There had been a whole lot of work to try and make sure this wouldn't happen. And the fantastic legal advocacy group there, what are they called? Pivot. Pivot had trained volunteers to watch, to like keep track of the police and make sure they weren't harassing people and stuff. And there were something like 15 times the usual number of police on the streets of Vancouver, because they'd seconded them from across the country, and the army were there. So there were a lot of kind of police and military bodies there to so-called keep the peace. So everyone's kind of amazed that there hadn't been more of this conflict. But the way I made sense of this, and I think there's a logic to this, is that there is a lot of interest in a city to not look like a repressive police state, because one of the things that happens during the Olympics is the world is watching. And so the intensive policing did not happen during the games, it happened before the games.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm sorry?
I said London was a bit different, but.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Jacqueline Kennelly. Your book is, what's it called? I'm sorry. It's oh gosh. I'm sorry. What's your book called?
Olympic Exclusions: Youth Poverty and Social Legacies.
Right on. And where can people get it?
You can order it on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I want to thank you very much for all your help. I understand you've been chatting with Aaron a bit, and you're going to produce some collateral for us. It's really appreciated. Thank you very, very much.
I think an op-ed I wrote is coming out tomorrow, I believe.
Fantastic.
In the Herald, yeah.
In the Herald? In our Herald?
Yep.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Jacqueline Kennelly, thank you very much. Have a great night.
You're welcome. Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Bye-bye.